When you're standing in front of a rack of audio gear and wondering whether the next big purchase will finally bridge the gap between a decent demo and a professional-sounding mix, the fear of overpaying for something that sounds great on paper but feels awkward in a real-world session is totally understandable. I've spent the last few weeks setting up the Universal Audio Apollox 8 Gen 2 in a home studio that already runs a handful of monitors, a pair of mics, and a modest DAW library, just to see if the hype lives up to the day-to-day workflow most of us need. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, the biggest question most people have is whether a premium-priced interface like the Apollox 8 actually makes a measurable difference when you're tracking a vocal or mixing a hip-hop beat on a laptop. The answer, in my experience, hinges less on raw numbers and more on the way the unit integrates with the rest of your signal chain. The Apollo series is built around UAD's DSP chips, which run the plugins internally, freeing up your CPU. That means you can insert classic analog emulations like a Teletronics LA2A compressor or a Neve preamp right at the input stage without taxing the computer. In a typical tracking session, I ran two Shure SM7B mics, a pair of AKG C414S, and a line-level synth, all with the UAD plugins active. The latency stayed under the threshold where I could monitor the processed signal comfortably, and I never hit a point where my DAW started stuttering. For anyone who's been burned by interfaces that promise zero latency monitoring but crumble under a handful of plugins, that separation between the DSP and the host CPU is a real, practical win. What also sets the X8 apart is the auto gain feature. It's a small button that, when pressed, scans each input, finds an optimal level, and sets the gain knob for you. In a busy mix session where you're juggling a live drum track, a vocal overdub, and a synth line, that saves you from the reflexive habit of guessing gain and then constantly turning it down when a hot take arrives. I used auto gain on the fly for a quick vocal rehearsal. The unit pegged the level just shy of clipping, which meant I had a clean signal to work with without having to dive into the mixer for a few seconds. It's a modest convenience, but when you're on a deadline, shaving even a minute off the gain set routine adds up. Now let's talk about the low-end handling, which is often the silent deal-breaker for bass-heavy producers. The Apollox 8 includes a bass management subwoofer routing option that allows you to send frequencies below a configurable point straight to a dedicated sub without muddying the main mix. I hooked the sub to a Genelec subwoofer during a test mix for a cinematic piece, and the result was a clearer, more defined bottom end without the typical boom that often forces you to roll off the bass in the master bus. If your work leans heavily on 808s, synth bass, or orchestral lows, this extra routing path can keep your mix tight without a separate hardware crossover. All that said, the unit is not without trade-offs that matter once you bring it out of the demo room. The biggest hidden cost is the steep learning curve of the UAD plugin ecosystem. Those 200-plus plugins are fantastic, but they each come with their own set of parameters and sometimes require a separate license purchase if you want to expand beyond the bundled bundle. I found myself spending a good half hour just figuring out which model of a classic console emulation would best complement a given vocal, which is fine if you enjoy tweaking, but could be a frustration if you just want a clean signal path and plan to add processing inside your DAW later. For producers who are already comfortable with their native plugins and don't need analog emulations baked into the hardware, the extra layer might feel like unnecessary overhead. Another practical consideration is connectivity. The Apollox 8 uses Thunderbolt 3, which delivers the bandwidth needed for its 8in/8out configuration and DSP processing, but that also means you have to be on a relatively new Mac or a Windows machine with a compatible Thunderbolt 3 port. I had to upgrade a mid-range laptop's port via an external Thunderbolt dock just to fit the interface, which added another $150 to the total spend. If your setup already has a suitable port, great, otherwise, the extra investment could push the total cost into a range where a slightly less powerful interface like a Focusrite Claret 8 Pre might become a more sensible entry point. So, who should seriously consider the Apollox 8? If you're a professional mixing engineer, a producer who relies heavily on classic analog plugins during tracking, or a home studio owner who wants to future-proof your workflow with a DS-centric system, The X8 delivers a blend of hardware processing, flexible routing, and a workflow-saving auto gain that feels like it was designed for people who record daily. It shines especially in environments where CPU headroom is at a premium. Think large orchestral sessions or heavily layered electronic productions. The subwoofer routing also makes it a